On September 15th, 2017, a spacecraft that had spent 13 years orbiting Saturn sent back its very last pictures, then deliberately burned itself apart in the planet's own atmosphere, on purpose, by design, exactly as engineers had planned years in advance. Before it did, its cameras captured a handful of final images that NASA's own project scientist described as a scrapbook, a farewell collection nobody who worked on the mission will ever forget. Stick around, because I'm going to walk you through exactly what Cassini's last photographs actually showed, why NASA chose to destroy a fully functioning spacecraft on purpose instead of simply letting it drift, and why those final images still carry so much weight years later. And if you want more of these deep dives into real published research instead of recycled headlines, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a lot more coming out of the mission that redefined what we know about Saturn. To understand why Cassini's final images carry the emotional weight they do, you first need to understand why the mission ended in such a deliberate, dramatic way in the first place, rather than simply running out of fuel and drifting silently. Cassini launched in 1997 and arrived at Saturn in 2004, spending the next 13 years studying the planet, its rings, and its extensive family of moons in more detail than any previous mission had ever managed. By 2017, the spacecraft was finally running low on the propellant needed to keep adjusting its orbit, and NASA engineers faced a genuinely important decision about how to end the mission responsibly. Two of Saturn's moons, Enceladus and Titan, had emerged during Cassini's own mission as genuinely compelling candidates in the search for potentially habitable environments elsewhere in the solar system. Enceladus with its confirmed subsurface ocean, and Titan with its complex organic chemistry. Simply letting Cassini drift uncontrolled after running out of fuel risked an eventual uncontrolled crash into one of those moons, potentially contaminating a genuinely pristine environment with residual Earth microbes that might have survived the journey clinging to the spacecraft's hardware. To prevent that outcome, NASA planned what the mission called the grand finale, a deliberate, carefully engineered end to the mission that would guarantee Cassini could never accidentally contaminate either moon. Beginning in April of 2017, the spacecraft started diving repeatedly through this roughly 200-mile-wide gap between Saturn itself and its innermost rings, a region no spacecraft had ever attempted to fly through before, gathering unprecedented close-up data with each pass. After completing that final series of daring orbits, Cassini used one last distant flyby of Titan to bend its trajectory onto a final irreversible path, one that would send it directly into Saturn's own atmosphere, where it would burn up completely and become, in a very literal sense, part of the planet it had spent 13 years studying. If you're finding this as moving as the mission team clearly did, drop a comment and let me know, because it genuinely helps me figure out what other space stories are worth covering next. Cassini's cameras kept working right up until the very end, and the images gathered during those final days form what Linda Spilker, the mission's project scientist, referred to in a press conference at the time as Cassini's own scrapbook, a phrase that captures the genuinely personal farewell quality the mission team felt about this final set of pictures. On September 13th, 2017, 2 days before the spacecraft's final plunge, Cassini captured a series of images that would turn out to be among its very last coherent looks at the broader Saturn system. Those pictures included a view of Saturn's rings, a wide, detailed look at the planet's northern hemisphere, close observations of the small moon Daphnis creating rippling wave patterns as it orbited within a gap in the rings, and a striking image of the icy moon Enceladus, appearing to sink slowly behind Saturn itself, sometimes described by those covering the story afterward as looking almost like a farewell portrait. Cassini's cameras also captured one final look at the hazy, orange moon Titan during this same closing stretch, a fitting last glimpse of the world that had ultimately provided the gravitational nudge sending the spacecraft toward its final destination. The actual final images, captured on September 14, 2017, just hours before Cassini's atmospheric entry, were considerably less dramatic in visual terms than some later artistic renderings would suggest, and it's worth being precise about that distinction, because a fair amount of confusion has circulated online in the years since about exactly what those last pictures actually looked like. The genuine final visible light image Cassini's imaging cameras ever captured was a comparatively simple, monochrome nighttime view of Saturn, illuminated only by sunlight reflecting off the planet's own rings, showing the specific patch of atmosphere where the spacecraft would plunge in roughly 14 hours. Alongside that visible image, Cassini's separate infrared mapping spectrometer captured a corresponding thermal view of the same region at a wavelength of 5 microns, showing heat radiating up from deep within Saturn's interior, glowing in red, with darker atmospheric clouds silhouetted against that inner warmth, with the specific impact zone marked inside a small outlined ellipse in the resulting image. That distinction matters because a considerably more dramatic, vividly colored image, sometimes shared online as Cassini's actual final photograph, is, according to fact-checking organizations, including Reuters and Snopes that have specifically investigated the claim, an artist's rendering rather than a genuine photograph the spacecraft ever captured. The real final images are quieter, more technical, and in some ways more affecting precisely because of that restraint. An unglamorous, functional snapshot, capturing exactly the patch of atmosphere the spacecraft was about to disappear into, rather than a dramatized cinematic farewell. Cassini kept transmitting scientific data for as long as it physically could during that final descent, well past the point where its cameras stopped functioning. As the spacecraft plunged deeper into Saturn's atmosphere, increasing atmospheric friction and heat eventually overwhelmed its systems entirely. Its last coherent radio signal reached NASA's Deep Space Network at 4:55 a.m. Pacific Time on September 15, 2017. Engineers and scientists gathered together at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory to watch that final signal arrive on the monitors in Mission Control, and footage from that room afterward shows the assembled team, many of whom had devoted decades of their careers to this single mission, embracing, applauding, and in several documented cases, visibly in tears as the signal finally went silent for good. It's worth explaining a little more about what those final days of data actually contributed scientifically, because Cassini wasn't simply taking farewell photographs for sentimental value. Right up until the connection was lost, the spacecraft continued gathering direct in situ measurements of Saturn's uppermost atmosphere, information that could never have been collected any other way, since no previous mission had ever been in a position, or willing to sacrifice itself, to fly directly into the planet's atmosphere and measure its composition and structure from the inside. That final plunge effectively doubled as one last previously impossible scientific experiment, wringing genuine research value out of the mission's inevitable conclusion, rather than treating the end of the mission as pure loss. Cassini's broader scientific legacy extends dramatically beyond just its final week, and it's worth appreciating the full scope of what those 13 years at Saturn actually accomplished, since it's easy for the dramatic ending to overshadow just how much the mission achieved along the way. Cassini's discovery of active geysers erupting from Enceladus' south pole in 2005 completely transformed scientific understanding of that small moon, eventually leading to the confirmed detection of a genuine subsurface ocean, and, in the years since the mission ended, continued reanalysis of its archived data revealing an increasingly complete list of the basic chemical ingredients considered necessary for life. Cassini also carried the European Space Agency's Huygens probe, which separated from the main spacecraft in December of 2004 and successfully landed on Titan's surface in January of 2005, becoming the first, and, to this day, the only spacecraft ever to touch down on a world in the outer solar system, sending back images of a genuinely alien landscape, shaped by liquid methane rather than water. That combination, 13 years of continuous observation punctuated by a deliberately dramatic, scientifically productive ending, is part of why Cassini's mission continues to be held up within the planetary science community as something close to a model for how a major mission should conclude. Rather than simply running out of fuel and drifting into silence, the mission's final act was engineered to protect the very worlds it had spent over a decade teaching humanity to care about, while extracting one last, genuinely unprecedented set of measurements in the process. That final scrapbook of images, quiet, technical, and considerably less theatrical than some of the artistic renderings that have circulated since, represents the genuine, documented end of one of the most scientifically productive planetary missions NASA has ever flown. So what does all of this actually add up to? A spacecraft that spent 13 years transforming our understanding of Saturn, its rings, and its moons deliberately flew itself into the planet's own atmosphere, sending back a final handful of quiet, unglamorous photographs, and continuing to transmit scientific data for as long as physically possible, right up until atmospheric friction finally silenced it for good. That ending wasn't an accident or a simple loss of contact. It was a carefully engineered final act, designed specifically to protect the potentially habitable moons the mission itself had spent over a decade convincing scientists were worth protecting in the first place. If stories like this one, grounded in real published history and honest, about which images are genuine and which are artistic recreations, are what you want more of, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because Cassini's archived data is still being studied today, and there's a real chance the next discovery, pulled from its 13 years of observations, adds one more chapter to a mission that, even years after its deliberate end, still hasn't finished teaching us everything it has to offer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.